Welcome, everybody. Good evening. Welcome, everybody, and good evening. Dear Itamar Mann, dear Dina, my name is Anna Pollmann, and as a research associate at the Jewish Museum Berlin, in charge of our digital lecture series. I warmly welcome you to the second event of this year's series of online conversations under the title Migration Jewish History. The diagnosis of a migration or refugee crisis is quickly underway. Once we are confronted with global political crisis to large-scale migration movements. The year 2015 was called the long summer of migration by some and the refugee crisis by others. In one way or the other, still shapes political discourse more than 10 years later. How valid are both these diagnoses in historical perspective? Backdrop of our series of online conversations, 5 scholars in development of international from different. They will reflect on the present, future of human rights as a political promise that must be upheld. We aim to uncover historical rights migration that are today. Last week or 2 weeks ago, political philosopher Sheila produced the Convention 1951 central document human rights protection, which seems more and more for migrants due to shifting and repressive border regimes. And also today's conversation will head to the question how migrants are historically and are still prevented or enabled to seek human rights remedies. With international law expert we will turn to the Mediterranean as a space of exchange of goods and persons, deadly space, as well as a space for political imagination. We will encounter the image of the vessel on the open sea, not sailing under any different historical episodes of maritime migration, but also as a metaphor pointing to weak spots of human rights protection. This year we cooperate with the daily newspaper Die Taz, our neighbor a streaming format. We are delighted that the of the domestic department at Taz for that, as an editor for the topic of migration and integration, has received multiple awards for her investigative reporting on the so-called ban on abortion. Her interview with survivors of the attack in Halle created the Reporter Award. Before we begin, I would like to thank Katja Watt, Ina Jürgens, for organizing this following evenings. I would like to mainly thank the Paul-Helbinger Stiftung for supporting the digital lecture series. Finally, I would like to invite you all to the Jewish Museum for an anniversary program in Berlin time. Dear Itamar, dear Dina, I'm looking forward to your conversation.
Thank you very much, Anna. I think we had some technical issues. I hope, dear audience, that you could hear Anna well. And if not, I hope you'll hear us better now. But anyways, Anna, thank you very much for the warm introduction. And also from my side, a very warm welcome to you, Itamar Mann. We're happy to have you here tonight. And also a very warm welcome to all of you who are here to listen and discuss with us tonight. This is the second lecture of Human Rights as the Last Utopia, Migration and Jewish History. As Anna just said, it's also the second round of the digital lecture series at the Jewish Museum Berlin, and this year in a cooperation with the Berlin-based daily newspaper Taz, which I'm very happy about because this is where I work. Are human rights the last utopia, as historian Samuel Moyn claimed, the last remaining universalist idea or ideal, and what would that mean about their historical roots? And considering the constant violation of human rights all over the world, are we not rather looking at a dystopia? Hannah Arendt had already expressed her skepticism in her famous chapter, The Aporia of Human Rights in the Origins of Totalitarianism, drawing on her own experience of statelessness during her exile in France in the 1930s. She knew that human rights can only be asserted within the framework of citizenship rights. René Cassin, a French Jewish lawyer who helped draft the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, also saw one of the greatest challenges in ensuring that the declaration applied to all those who exercise their freedom of movement. The very existence of human rights and refugee rights is very closely linked to Jewish history, to the Shoah, and to the failure of the international community to offer protection to the European Jews. Issues of minority protection, of shifting borders, persecution, and statelessness are deeply embedded in modern Jewish history. In our first lecture with Sheila Ben Habib 2 weeks ago, we looked into the origins of the Geneva Refugee Convention and its normative force, despite all its shortcomings. Tonight, we will focus on the Mediterranean Sea, among others, a space that has become a mass grave, but also has been central for migration and refugees for many centuries. I am happy that we are having the chance to discuss this with our guest Itamar Mann. He is professor of international law at the University of Haifa, currently on leave, and a visiting professor at the law faculty of the University of Münster. His works move between doctrine, theory, and history. His research focuses on the law on the sea, migration and refugee law, international criminal law, and the conceptual foundations of legal responsibility in situations of crisis. Alongside his academic research, Itamar Mann has been closely engaged in human rights practice. He serves as the president of Border Forensic, an interdisciplinary collective investigating border violence and state accountability. Welcome, Itamar. And of course, I have a lot of questions that I prepared, but we also want to include your questions from the audience. We will have time for that in the end of this discussion. But already now and throughout the whole conversation, you can already send us your questions. You can either write them into the comment section below this YouTube live stream. To do so, you would have to be logged in into your YouTube account. If you don't have one, or if you don't want to log in, or if you forget your password, you can also send us your questions via email to taztalk@taz.de. So far for the organizational part. Itamar, 10 years ago, you wrote a book called Humanity at Sea. In this book, you analyzed the origins of human rights and refugee law in the 20th century and its development. Why did you decide to write this book in 2016? And why with a focus on the high seas?
Yeah, first, thank you so much for hosting me. I really appreciate this opportunity to speak with you, and I especially appreciate the opportunity to speak directly after Sheila Ben Habib, who incidentally is also a teacher of mine, and one of the people that first read this book as I was writing it. Sheila was my reader at Yale University as I did my dissertation that later became the book. I started thinking about this topic as a law student. I was studying law in Tel Aviv University, and there was a refugee law clinic that was opened at the time. And this was around 2005, more or less, and people from Sudan and Eritrea in particular had been entering the territory of Israel seeking asylum, and the students, and among them myself, we started to represent them or help represent them before the UNHCR as well as Israeli courts. And when I started to do this, I realized from the encounters with these people that some of the stories they told were stories that were similar in various ways to stories that I heard from my family, stories of persecution and stories of flight that involved Jewish people from Europe most of my family is from Germany originally, and so all of them had found their ways to Palestine during the Mandate era after they had been persecuted by the Nazis. And that really led me to try to study this issue academically more deeply. And as I was studying it, I realized that this issue of maritime migration is not only kind of interesting in terms of aesthetically, if you will, in terms of the pictures that it generates, but also conceptually. So this was, as I was working on my dissertation, it was before the so-called Summer of Migration, which Anna had already mentioned. And so the pictures of migrants at sea were not as spectacularly visible as they later became spread on the front pages of newspapers across Europe and in the United States. At that time, it was less well known, but there was still, people that had been found off the Canary Islands, in beautiful beaches where people went to vacations, or in the mid-Mediterranean or in Indonesia. These stories came from everywhere, and they were very interesting. And in terms of the conceptual aspect, really, I realized that as Anna already had said, something about the lonely vessel without a flag has been a major metaphor for thinking about refugees in the mid-20th century. So the book opens with this nice sentence from a lawyer who was central to the protection of refugees in the 20th century, a man named Paul Weiss. And he writes, "The status of a person who is deprived of national protection is anomalous. A stateless person, and this applies equally to refugees, has been compared to a vessel on the open sea, not sailing under any flag." This is, for an international lawyer, a reference to the fact that you don't know where to fit this personality. This flag on a vessel is supposed to give the vessel a place and a category in terms of a legal understanding of the situation. And similarly, a man or a woman without known identity, sometimes only with their clothes on their body, is something that the lawyer kind of doesn't know how to deal with. It's perplexing. So this conceptual parallel really struck me, and I thought it would be an interesting way to organize this philosophical and historical study of the refugee issue, which was already clear a central issue of the 21st century in legal and political terms.
Now you mentioned already the vessel without the flag. Your book centers around the high seas, an area in which no nation state has sovereignty. And I think this is, this in connection with this, you could have a person here in Berlin without a passport, for example, but it would be something else than a person without a flag, so to say, on the high seas, right? Why is this field of the high seas so important for your examination of human rights and their potentials and their shortcomings?
So this is part of the same puzzle that I spoke about in terms of how to respond to the call of this person. So if we talk about someone who's located in Berlin, we immediately know that German law will apply to them. And there is this kind of tendency of the lawyer to, in a way, set aside the ethical question and treat a human need in terms of a legal and ultimately a bureaucratic set of operations that then will determine their fate. And that is a way of kind of bracketing the moral and trying to put in place a positive procedure that will be the same for similar cases and will have this kind of value of fairness that we associate with the law sometimes. But at sea, things somehow become more confused. So of course, the law of the sea does organize jurisdiction also at sea. It's not like if you're in the high seas, it's a no man's land or a kind of, place where you cannot think in legal categories. But the legal categories are different. So, for example, in common law countries, we have a kind of presumption against a duty of rescue. This is not necessarily true in civil law countries or continental law countries such as Germany, but in the US and in the UK, there is no duty of rescue. If you kind of encounter a person in need, you are not liable if you simply ignore them. On the high seas, under Article 98 of the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, but this has kind of customary deep roots. The presumption is precisely the opposite. There is a kind of interpersonal or inter-vessel solidarity that is required, and that is then institutionalized by the law of the sea through various state authorities. But basically, the evolution of this was, in part due to the fact that people were traveling for hundreds of years across seas. And the basic idea was one day I save you and the next day you save me. We're all exposed to the same risks of nature, of the waves, of the winds, of the unexpected. And so there is this kind of requirement with no sovereign in view. And similarly, there is a kind of presumption for a very, very wide right to movement. So the freedom of navigation, which is also a kind of customary rule that also that has colonial roots for sure, in terms of the exploitation of vast areas in the developing or in the colonies over centuries. Also has other roots. Also has roots in terms of a kind of idea that the sea belongs to everyone, and everyone should be able to have opportunities to move and have opportunities to navigate and to fish, etc. So there is a different kind of set of background legal assumptions. In some ways, it's a reversed set of legal assumptions to those that typically occur on land. And against that backdrop, I think there is an opportunity to re-examine the ethical intuitions that we may or may not have that are somehow eliminated or set aside by this kind of bureaucratization that legal form often takes. And specifically, states have responded in ways that convey certain patterns to maritime migration and certain ways of trying to eliminate responsibility or trying to shadow responsibility or create procedures that will not necessarily emphasize the ethical question that arises. But time and time again, when we study the historical material, we see that that has created problems. It has created problems for individuals to say that a certain person who might live or die according to their own decision can be disregarded if the law requires so. And so the law of the sea and maritime space has been a place in which at some moments you can try to uncover a certain kind of universalism from below that individuals may feel the need to insert into their interpretations of the law that applies on them.
Now, you already talked about this inter-vessel solidarity. Your book, even though you wrote it before, was published in 2016, like after the climax of, Anna said it, you said it, what some call the summer of migration and some call the migration crisis. A time when war and crisis in Syria and in other regions, in other countries of the region, forced millions of people to flee their homes, and many of them lost their lives in the Mediterranean. And
Yes.
you said it, we've like by now, after you wrote the book, pictures have been all over the screens, the newspapers, terrible pictures. But your book is starting long before the summer of migration, around 100 years back into the interwar period and long before the Geneva Refugee Convention. What connects these two moments in history?
Yeah. So first, I want to kind of offer a certain caveat. I don't think that one would have to start with the Jewish refugees that moved to Palestine under the Mandate in the 1940s And especially I deal with Exodus, very famous Exodus vote of 1947 as July 1947 as the first chapter of the book. One could also conceivably start in other places. There has been maritime movement in other parts of the world, and there is no analytic reason to start specifically here. This is not a kind of original moment. But it is a moment that is an important moment, and it is a moment that helps me to, I think, discuss some of the analytical, philosophical questions that I try to explore in the book. So, to say just a few words about this episode, as I said, in July 1947, about 5,000 people leave a displaced people camp that is in the south of France near Marseille, and, on the boat that is called the Exodus. This, of course, has biblical resonance with the Exodus from Egypt, the mythical story of the Exodus from Egypt during Moses's, chapter in the Exodus in the Bible. And the vessel is organized by a number of paramilitary groups, including most prominently the Haganah. This is one of many vessels that are reaching Palestine in a similar way, some of them from Europe, some of them from Asia Minor, some of them from even North Africa. It's told as a story of national self-determination, a story of nation building. And there's a very, very famous film starring Paul Newman about the Exodus. And in this context, it's all about nationality, and it's all about building a new state. And Hannah Arendt already noted that in terms of the solution of the refugee problem, as she calls it in Europe, the establishment of the State of Israel was very, very questionable because it ended up displacing 750,000 Palestinians who were never allowed to return to their homes. So this story seems to connect in a kind of Gordian knot between the solution of a refugee issue and the creation of another new refugee issue, in a kind of vicious circle that seems not to have any way out. And the reason why I start with the book with this story is to try to take a step back from that narration and say, are we seeing here something else? Before it solidifies into this kind of nation building project, these people are also humans, and they're humans that demand rights as such. Earl Harrison was an American lawyer that was sent to this area and was also reporting about the displaced persons camps in the south of France. And he says very simply in a report that he writes for the US government that the people there are languishing, they are in terrible conditions, and if no government has effective remedies for them, they will act in a way for themselves because they have no other option. And indeed, as he predicts, that's what happens with this movement. And mandate British vessels they intercept the Exodus. They send people to extraterritorial imprisonment in Cyprus. The people who are on the Exodus during this encounter try to convey in various ways that they are humans and they need protection, just as we have seen in more recent years in the Mediterranean done by other groups. And they also resort ultimately to minor forms of we can call violence. They throw potatoes at the British Navy people, just as has happened in various cases in the mid-Mediterranean by other groups. So the patterns are very similar. And also this kind of extraterritorial detention in Cyprus is very similar to instances that we have seen much later in the history of this problem, including in Guantanamo Bay with the extraterritorial detention of Haitian migrants by the United States, asylum seekers and migrants by the United States, and in the context of the Pacific Solution and the Australian policies, in Manus and Nauru in the Pacific Islands, Papua New Guinea. And so all these resemblances with events that come much later, and the opportunity to say that a political issue of collective self-determination is also, if read against the grain, an issue of individual rights and an issue of basic protections for all humans, made this a very interesting exercise for the beginning of the book. Some later chapters seemingly don't have this kind of political collective self-determination aspects and are presenting themselves primarily and or maybe almost exclusively as issues of individual human rights. But I want to say that too is misleading. These two things are not easily severable from one another. And in any case that this kind of idea of nation building and self-determination and statehood is one way to protect rights, one way that may have enormous human costs, but there are also other ways. And there's an underlying kind of basic claim of humans to address themselves to other humans and say, we're here, that reemerges in all these different episodes.
What you're referring to now is what you also call in the book the rights of encounter. What are they, and what is their connection to Hannah Arendt's term of the right to have rights?
Yes, yes. So this will require a slight diversion to legal philosophy, and I'm allowing myself to do so in kind of a little bit of simplified terms, but yeah. So legal philosophers have a perennial ancient debate about what is the source of law. And so basically there's two camps in traditionally speaking here. One is a camp called the positivists. The positivists believe ultimately that law is emanates from power, from political power. So basically the sovereign has the ability to make people obey his commands in a way that is backed by a sanction. So to know what law is, we need to know, what it's a human decision, oftentimes a human decision that is based on power. This is generally speaking the positivist idea of law. The natural law idea of law is different. It says that law is based on a moral imperative, and the moral imperative is based on what's called a moral fact. So it's objectively true. It's not something that is a matter of opinion or personal opinion, but it is an objective truth that is moral truth. Just like we have natural facts, we also have moral facts, and these moral facts are to be discovered, and discovering them means that we have a basis for the law. This is the basic debate between these two positions, and the book tries to carve out a different position that is rooted essentially in the European philosophical tradition of phenomenology. So it's kind of like the natural law tradition in terms of its emphasis on morality, but it doesn't claim that morality is based on objective fact, but on an imperative that is experienced by the self as binding. So it's in a kind of existential commitment. I don't know if this is an objective truth that I'm following, but I know that I must follow it in terms of who I am. And I need to uphold this imperative in terms of who I am. And someone else might not experience this or not, be bound to the same underlying imperative. But I know that in order to remain true to what I believe should be the case for everyone, I need to act in a certain way. Critics of my book have said this is just a natural law in other terms, but I want to insist this is different because it's not based on a claim about the ontological truth of the imperative, but on an experience. Okay, and this is, I appeal to a Jewish philosopher named Emmanuel Levinas to explain this. Now comes the issue of the right to have rights, and Hannah Arendt, who is also a member of this phenomenological tradition of philosophical thinking, she has this episode, this chapter that we have already kind of mentioned here, in which she says that rights can only be grounded on political community and on collectivity. So ultimately, there's no real rights for a stateless person. A stateless person is considered to be bare life, really can be violated by whoever, because in order to have rights, we need this kind of collectivity, this kind of community, and a mutual protection among individuals. And the book tries to say, no, 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 there is a kind of right that we can talk about that is even earlier than this establishment of the community, and is based on these kind of experiences of ethical imperative, and it in a way is a precondition for this kind of community that I don't think is wrong to be discussing or to be conceptualizing. I think it's also important, very, very important basis for law and for rights, and that's undeniable, and it would be silly to deny that. But even if we, but in the earlier stage, there is this kind of right of encounter. There is this kind of idea that when persons are encountering each other in a way that one person has power and the other person is relatively powerless, an existential question arises whether the powerful can take the life or ignore the claim upon life of the powerless. And if the powerful side feels that they in some way are prevented from doing so, that is because they are bound to human rights. That is because they're bound to human rights as the rights of encounter, as a kind of phenomenological pre-community sense that is not natural, that is not based on fact, but on experience. So I think I tried to explain it, but yeah, maybe there's more to say, but I guess that was my relatively short version.
And is that, that sense of who we are and of morality, is that connected to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to the Geneva Convention that we all only have after World War II and the Shoah, and that did not exist back then when, for example, Exodus set sail, or even before, there were all these boats with Jewish refugees during the Second World War and during the Shoah that tried to escape and save their lives, as the St. Louis, a famous case in
Yes.
1939, carrying around 940 Jewish refugees from Germany, and that tried to find refuge in Cuba, were sent back, and almost all of them were murdered in the Holocaust. So did that happen because this idea of human rights was not like established in a way that as we have it today, or why, is that the moment that changed?
Yeah, so I want to say, if you try to think about this rights of encounter issue from a social perspective, not in terms of the individual ethical commitment, but in terms of a kind of wider sense that many people feel belong to this project, and many people feel committed to this project, the project of international law in the post-World War II era, then you say, in a way, the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the 1951 Refugee Convention are expressions of that consciousness, are expression of that consciousness as it arises. And it's not by mere chance that within this kind of historical cultural orientation, many people have then referenced the St. Louis as a bad example of what should not happen. It's almost like a kind of a specific instance of the wider never again imperative that we kind of are familiar with in Germany, I think, very, very much. So it's a trope. Remember the St. Louis. This will happen, will be, cited before the US Supreme Court in various cases later on. And so in this kind of cultural orientation, we can think that these are all expressions of that sentiment. But in a way, I want to resist the urge to reduce this rights of encounter theory to a cultural orientation, because the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the Refugee Convention, and all the important human rights instruments, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights from 1966, they all have also reasons that are geostrategic, that are based in political interest, that are based in power, that are simply the matter of the interests of the strong. We referenced Samuel Moyn's very important book, The Last Utopia. And the thing about The Last Utopia of human rights is that for Moyn, it is an utopia that belongs to the United States in the Cold War and expresses its interests. And in terms of my own theory, I don't want to, do that reduction. I want to say that these instruments exist as an expression of this kind of cultural orientation, not only as a sociological fact, but also as a matter of us upholding them as such. So only if people, perceive them as such, live through them as such, seek to uphold them as such, do they remain in this function. And it's very possible that, that sentiment will wane or is waning. But it's not a matter of simple, it's once again not a matter of simple sociological or cultural fact. It's a matter of experience and of choice. And, we have a way of, trying to influence that and live through that in a way that may prevent or may uphold certain principles that arose in that time if we feel that they're still important and binding upon us.
In the political, and you talked about power now, right? And in the
Yeah.
political debate around refugees and asylum, the center is often the interests and the capacities of nation states, their obligations, and how to balance these things.
Of course.
Refugees themselves mostly are, in this discussion, objects whose fate is decided upon by others.
Yeah.
And the right of encounter that you described challenges that perception. How so?
So the idea is that, there is this expression of voting by your feet. And so that's the idea that simply by movement, you're already, in a way, performing a kind of agency and a kind of political participation on the world stage. That's the basic idea. And so if I'm a migrant that is leaving a coast in northern Africa, a Libyan coast, in recent years, for example, is where a lot of these issues have risen, and we can talk about that more as well. But I'm leaving the coast, and I'm setting sail with a boat. Maybe it's a smuggler's boat. Maybe it's not even seaworthy. My understanding of this is that this is surely an act of desperation and of necessity and of hopelessness. But this is also, at the same time, an act of agency, an act that is challenging borders and is challenging the current regime. And in that way, it's by necessity also an act of hopefulness. You're there because you think that you're there because you think that you deserve a chance. And you're there because you think that you want to make someone give you that chance, whether it's clandestinely and then, through a long period of attempts to integrate or to ask for asylum or whatever, or through this encounter, which is not clandestine, but a kind of confrontation in which a vessel has to rescue you and maybe then give you also an attempt to ask for asylum. This is something that the European Court of Human Rights has found in a famous 2012 case called Hirsi, Jama, and others versus Italy. And so that's the basic paradigm that politics is not only words, it's not only language or discourse, it's also movement, it's also gesture, it's also, other philosophers have written about sit-ins, for example, or about strikes, or about demonstration, human chains, all these kinds of forms of acting in the public sphere. I want to say migration is also in some way such a form. Now, this is not only an abstract claim that is based on speculation. It's also a concrete claim based on documents and historical archives. The place where that is even, perhaps, comes in the most clear way from the archive that I found in this book is the context of the Vietnamese boat people after the 1975 removal of the United States presence after the Vietnam War. And they are, there is a lot of, political organization against people who move. Northern Vietnam publishes a book called Those Who Leave, which is a very, offensive book towards these boat people who are acting against the collective in a way. But these boat people also act collectively, and they think about how do they impose obligations towards their bodies on the U.S. And they do so through movement, they do so through advocacy, and they end up triggering a process that leads to the 1979 Geneva framework that ended up distributing many of them to the United States and to other allies of the United States during the Cold War. They were participants in this project, even if they didn't have a place at the table. That's the claim.
What I found interesting about this part in your book is that you're saying even if they were not sitting at the table, and even if they maybe didn't even know that
Yes.
people were in a room sitting at the table, they still participated in it and influenced the outcome. You also write that about the role of embarrassment when claiming the rights of encounter. What's the role of embarrassment?
So the encounter, as I just described it, is a kind of, I guess, dyadic moment. So there's two entities that are involved in this encounter, the powerful party and the powerless party. And in the way this dyadic encounter is processed, oftentimes the powerful party has either an imagination or a reality of a third party that is observing the situation. It's kind of like, if you want in psychological terms, it's kind of like a superego or a conscience. What will other people looking at me say? But in social terms, it doesn't. It can also be the fact that sometimes this may be registered, photographed, investigated, and so forth. And so the embarrassment is this idea that as a person who's experiencing this binding nature of human rights not in terms of the positive law, but in terms of the rights of encounter, I may be influenced by this idea that I don't want to be taken to be someone who doesn't uphold the value of human life. I'm embarrassed by that. I may be embarrassed by that. I may be ashamed by that. And it's a kind of a motivation that is based on the potential of guilt. Then it also is something that migrants and refugees can use in order to mobilize. They can, in a way, try to stage events in which this embarrassment will make people do stuff that would otherwise not be done, make people give them remedies that would otherwise not be given to them. It's something that, within a strategic understanding of the social condition, can be used and can be opportunistically almost deployed. And so in as much as it remains, the rights of encounter remain something that binds us, that is also part of what's going on. Now, someone might say, and here also I'm referring to criticisms that I got about the book later on. Someone might say, okay, but this is a very, very basic idea of civil rights. It's kind of like, I don't know, Martin Luther King marching and saying, "I am a man." And so, it's and trying and thereby trying not to be shot. And maybe, in the end, the person is shot. So if there is no embarrassment, as I think is the case oftentimes in the conversations around this today, not only in the conversations, but in the practices that we see today, then that is useless. And so it might be the case that there is a hope to be rescued, a hope to embarrass a powerful side, and the powerful side, and instead of being embarrassed, the powerful side simply laughs and goes on. And this is, I think it's a good description of the general orientation that we have seen in some of the policies against migrants and refugees, for example, in the United States, during the Trump administration, this Trump administration and the previous Trump administration. So it's a very fragile thing in the end, but I think that for many of us, it still has some role in the way that international relations are proceeding.
Yeah, now you already built the bridge to the nowadays. Your book is about 10 years old now. We're talking in the week that the Common European Asylum System will, how do you say, be put into action on Friday, with all the measures to keep people out of the European Union, to not let them enter where they would have a right to apply for asylum, not get asylum, but apply for asylum, with detention-like centers outside of European territories and so on. You already mentioned the United States. And I remember you wrote that a human rights claim can only be coupled with a remedy when it meets a human rights commitment. I also remember German politicians, European politicians in the last years, like saying that the human rights law that we have, the Geneva Convention, everything, it's annoying because it binds us to helping people. Let's maybe get rid of it. Let's leave it. And even if not, I mean, Germany is still a signatory. The Fortress Europe exists. So are politicians, European politicians, American politicians still embarrassable today?
It's a good question, and I think that as I was preparing for this event tonight, I looked back at the book, and it's not something that I do often, and I did feel that I was writing the book in a little bit of a different period. I did feel like the kind of experience then was that refugee rights and refugee protections are under enormous peril, but it's a kind of open question whether they survive this peril. And right now, in many borders in the world, especially at the kind of fault lines between the developing and the developed world, we have seen systematic refoulement, contrary to Article 33 of the Refugee Convention, not responded to by legal authorities in any real effective way.
Just a second, maybe for the people that don't know the term, it's like that you're not allowed to send somebody back to where they
will experience well-founded fear of persecution. Thank you. Yeah, that's very important. And that's the founding issue of law. It's kind of the fundamental principle. So if it's kind of regularly, routinely violated, it's a good sign that the whole system of refugee protection is not working, or at least not as conceived in the mid-20th century. Yeah, it's not working, I think we can say. So does any of this hold any truth today? Before answering, I want to emphasize the depth of the problem. So we're talking about probably hundreds of people killed by drones by the United States government in the Pacific and in the Caribbean, under the claim that they are trafficking drugs. But many of them are migrants, and that's acknowledged by the U.S. government. And these are instances that by all means, are legally characterized as assassinations. It's not some. It's the U.S. government systematically murdering people at sea. That's what's going on under the Trump administration, and I'm not the only one who says this. This is not even a fringe position among lawyers. It's a very basic understanding. And in terms of Europe, Europe is doing much of what it's doing not through an open flaunting of the law, not through an open kind of, okay, we're not going to be bound by law anymore at all, which is basically what the Trump administration is saying, but through legal processes that are trying in a sophisticated way to eliminate any real responsibility that the European Union has towards refugees. And this is not entirely new. You're right that we're going through a very, very intense moment in that regard in terms of refugee and migration policy, but it goes back to the establishment of Frontex as the border control agency of Europe that is almost impossible to legally challenge in a court by its very structure and founding documents. And it goes to issues like all these externalization agreements where countries outside of the European Union kind of enforce the European Union borders from the outside. And so I think that just to summarize the bleakness of the situation that we're in, I think on the one hand, we have a kind of push to flaunt and eliminate the law as such, led by the Trump administration, but also represented in Europe by right-wing governments and parties, for example, Nigel Farage and Reform in the UK, AfD here in Germany, and in other parts of Europe. Each country, of course, France, have their representatives of this push. And on the other side, we have a kind of technocratic, more conservative orientation to say, okay, we are still bound by the law, but we have ways of legally dealing with the law such that it doesn't expose us to risk of migration. It's always cast in the language of risk. And these two things are really two sides of the same coin in my mind. They ultimately two strategies to do the same thing, which is to create a condition where refugee rights are eliminated. So is this a kind of fait accompli at this time? I think not. I think it's not a fait accompli. I think, at least in Germany, the results of the recent elections with the rise of the left party are showing something different. Not all, but a lot of members of the left party are very, very strong supporters of this framework. I can say as a teacher of international law to students in a German university right now, I teach at Münster, where I'm also located right now. There's enormous interest among students in this issue, and it's not interest, contrary to what I just said. It's not based on certain party affiliation. People just think about, the Ukrainians that have entered here. They think about the Syrians that are here for some years now, and Merz is trying to remove them and send them back to Syria. But many of them are very, very integrated into this society. And it's something that moves people on a very, very fundamental level. So I don't think that it's going to be anywhere off the agenda and closed story anytime soon. I should also comment that, this rhetoric of a crisis and the refugee convention is over and it's dead and gone. This is something that has been, dovetailed with this area of law since its inception and even before its inception. So there's a very, provocative and I think insightful essay by a German lawyer that also had fled to the United States, also Jewish, Otto Kirchheimer, it's called Asylum. And he writes about the fact that law will never really solve this. And every time that there will be a kind of mass influx, as the term is, it will seem like the law is completely taken by political anxieties and political fears, and that are very understandable, and that also relate to economic anxieties and people, really fighting or feeling that their livelihoods are in some way under threat. But this doesn't mean that the frameworks are completely dislocated. It just means that this is very much within us as a dialectical process that is constant and that is recurring. And I think that with the context of the climate crisis, and once again here, I'm not the only one who thinks this, far from it. But I think that with the context of the climate crisis, we are rethinking these frameworks. We're trying to give them new meaning, and they will be really important with displacement that will, by necessity, continue across borders, also due to changes in climate, desertification, salination of water sources, etc.
Before we open to questions from the audience, you can really send your questions. We'll come to them in a minute. You just mentioned the future and the climate crisis. We talked a lot about your old book now that is 10 years old. You're also writing a new book currently, Life Raft Manifesto, Democratic Survivalism and the Sea, in which you examine how democratic principles can be preserved in the face of climate change and mass displacement, as you just mentioned. So now we talked a lot about history, but of course we also want to talk a little bit about the future and how it can look like and what can be done to maybe make it look a bit brighter than the present. Will we find answers to that in your book?
Yeah, it's a hard question because I think the basic answer is that a lot of climate policy is revolving around the term a just transition. So the idea is that there needs to be transition to green energy, for example, in a way that is just, for example, towards workers that have been, very much dependent on traditional energy sources. So how to have that transition in a way that's not disruptive for society and disruptive, especially for people who are reliant on wages. And what I'm starting from in this new book that I hope will come out before the end of the year, but we'll see, is that in terms of the climate process, we are already in overshoot. So we're above the limitations that were set in the Paris Agreement, and we are facing a certain kind of climate collapse for sure, whatever we do now. And so we need to think about just collapse, not only about just transition, but about just collapse. And the book really pulls out this thread of thinking through the maritime from this previous book, and especially through maritime vessels and ways in which seafarers have always prepared for storms and for predictable, but not exactly predicted climate events at sea, and asks whether, in terms of a kind of democratic society, we can apply some of these insights that come from maritime law in terms of preparation, preparation that is expecting to have a certain level of loss, but to distribute that loss in a way that is somehow fair and not always falling in the end at those who are already the most vulnerable in a society. So I hope to be able to talk about that in other occasions, but it does continue some of the themes that we talked about today. And yeah, I want to thank you again for this really interesting, I mean, for me, meaningful conversation.
Thank you for, we're not done yet, so I'll thank you
I know,
in the
but
end.
just for your questions and for giving me this opportunity. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, and let me look into the chat if there are any yet. Not yet, then I'll keep asking questions. I'll go back a little bit to when we talked about embarrassment and if people still are embarrassable. And I was wondering also, as a journalist, of course, about the role of media and like publicity to that embarrassment, because, I used to work as our editor for German migration politics. And so I'm still interested in the topic, of course, which is maybe also why I'm moderating this discussion, but I'm also still on a lot of mailing lists. And I keep getting these messages about people who drowned in the Mediterranean, about rescue ships in distress because they're not like either blocked or even shot at by Libyan
Yes.
boats. And all these things today hardly make it into the news. It's a very different situation to like compared to 10 years ago when like not everybody, you should never say everybody, but so many people in the world know the picture of Alan Kurdi, of this toddler washed onto a Greek beach, drowned. And it's also this picture, which really is like the embarrassment, right? That set things into action. But people are still drowning. We just don't look at them anymore. Like, how could that happen?
So how could that happen? I guess part of what also becomes very, very clear from looking at this historically is that there is a kind of welcome fatigue or rescue fatigue that occurs not only today, but also in previous events in which large-scale migration and refugee flows occurred. And so, in many historical sources, you see this kind of initial reaction, okay, let's help, let's save, and then some time passes and people end up getting a little more stingy with their resources and with their time. So I think this is understandable, and it doesn't necessarily mean that there will be no other events that will make it to the media. So, for example, we can think about the Ukrainian refugee crisis that did in some ways make it to the media after a lot of fatigue. And people said this is because these people are white. These is because these people are not Middle Eastern migrants, not African migrants, and so there's easier empathy towards them. And that may be part of the part of the reason, indeed. But it still is the fact that there was some change and this issue was reopened. And I'm not precluding the idea that it can also be reopened by people who are Black or Arabic speaking or not from the global North. Sometimes, history has these surprises, and I think that when we look at it over some few decades, not even such a enormously long term, but just a number of decades, we see that even after the attention has waned, sometimes it's then rising again. But I couldn't agree more that the attention now is far away from these humanitarian and human issues. So, for example, just to name one example that I feel compelled to mention here, if we have the time,
Sure.
around the COVID crisis, a researcher named Niamh Keady-Tabal, who was a PhD student at the time, now researcher, postdoc, very, very talented person. We noticed first online on social media, and then we investigated it, that migrants from Middle Eastern countries mainly were put on rescue vessels, inflatable rafts at the shape of a tent, typically in orange, by the Greek Coast Guard and left in the Aegean Sea, simply abandoned there. And we were amazed by this behavior. It was startling to us that such a cruel behavior may be possible towards humans, and it kind of goes on. And we tried to help exposing this, and a number of journalists, also Tommy Olson was from a group called Aegean Boat Report, was the first person to expose this. We worked on it. It ended up in the New York Times. It ended up in various, in Der Spiegel, various other kind of pretty prominent news sources. And I think it's still going on. And we're now 6 years later. I think these instances still happen, and I think it's careful, it's not, I don't know the number, but I would not be surprised if Tommy Olsen says this very, very clearly, that we're now with hundreds and hundreds of people who have been subjected to this behavior. And there's people that I've spoken with who have been subjected to this behavior multiple times individually. So, including a case that is litigated before the European Court of Justice currently on this issue, from a man named Allah Hamoudi, who's a Syrian and is represented by a group called Frontlex. In any case, I think that it's true that we are in a very, very grim time in terms of this kind of solidarity. I just want to insist that it's not historically unprecedented, and that the underlying issues will remain pressing and will continue to trigger, I think, responses by people.
Thank you. I have a question from the audience. It starts with a thank you for all your answers or mini lectures, very illuminating. And then it goes on. You also mentioned the role of moral sentiments when it comes down to deal with the right of encounter. Embarrassment was your fascinating example. The other side would be anger, like the refugees on the Exodus throwing potatoes at members of the British Navy. So my question is, how much anger is okay, or is there a moral limit to moral sentiments when it comes down to the right of encounter?
That is really, really interesting and a really, really interesting question. Thank you for the person who asked it, whoever they are. I think so. What's so interesting here is that we are pushing ourselves against the border between nonviolent and violent action. So the border between nonviolent and violent action is not given. It is also something that is experienced, interpreted. It has different historical shapes in different periods. And in order for this kind of rights of encounter approach to work, part of the argument is that it must be nonviolent. So it must be not addressable in terms of an enemy coming to attack me. Because when an enemy comes to attack me, there is also a legal framework that then allows just simply to kill them. This is what Trump, in some ways is trying to invoke when they're using drones against people who are alleged drug traffickers, according to their narrative. But I think it's completely unconvincing that they're using these drones against violent behavior. If it was convincing, it would be a different story. We would be in a different legal regime, and it would be a different story. So these examples, such as throwing potatoes, for example, or there are other examples like destroying property sometimes. They are examples that start to push against and maybe look like a form of violence, but they're still not really violence in the sense of being able to declare that someone is an enemy and then I'm allowed to shoot them. And so it's part of the strategy, if we look at it from the perspective of someone who's trying to deploy this rights of encounter, to use as much as force as possible without crossing the border and getting into violence, in which case you're no longer able to use that kind of strategy.
Thank you. There's another question from a journalist in the US who asks, what can you say about the increasing criminalization by Italy and other states of humanitarian rescue by sea? Rescuers are sometimes accused of being smugglers.
Yes. Well, I can say quite a few things about this. It's an issue that I've also studied. I'm trying to think where is the best place to start.
You have a few minutes.
Yeah. So I think that one place to start is to say, Yeah. One place to start is to say that together with Julia Morao Permosar, who's a Austrian Brazilian sociologist, political scientist, we have conducted a study of rescue volunteers and search and rescue in the mid-Mediterranean. And we have discussed this issue with many individuals involved in various organizations in terms of this perception that they are smugglers or colluding with smugglers. And I have to say very openly that part of the motivation for the study was to see whether this allegation, which is oftentimes used in a very aggressive way by governments against these volunteers, whether it has some grain of truth in it. So whether there is a collusion with smugglers that is necessary, even without judging it, in order to save people. And what we've found is that people are very aware of this, and they're creating all kinds of screens and mechanisms to try to work in this area without being legally responsible for smuggling offenses. And so there are various techniques that people use in order to be able to rescue someone, but not be in communication, for example, with people that are on the shore, for example, in Libya, in direct communication with them, because that will then make you liable or responsible for potentially a smuggling offense. So you're trying to rescue the people, but not get into too much contact that will then make you liable. But as interestingly, we found that many volunteers in this area also see governments as potentially criminal. So some of the instructions that they may get from governments, or orders to use this port and not that port, etc., they're also perceived in terms that are sometimes similar to the perceptions towards the smugglers. And there's also, in that case, an attempt to cabin some of the collaboration with governments, collaborate with them only to the necessary degree that makes it possible to operate, but not necessarily help governments impose stricter border controls by rescue, which is something that surely governments do. So rescue can be a way of border control, because if you rescue a person and then immediately return them, for example, to a Libyan coast, it is like creating a firm border at sea. And so this is the double dilemma, which I thought was really, really interesting in this context.
I have a last question from the audience because it fits to what you just said. But we also only have very few minutes left, so let's see what you can make out of it. The question is, sea rescue has been seen as a moral obligation for several centuries. At what point does this perception change, and what does it say about the formation of moral collectives?
Very interesting. I think that this is a research program. So in 2 minutes, I don't know if I can do it justice. But what I would flag in terms of the research program is to connect it to questions about technology. So the issue of sea rescue as a tradition has been connected to the fact that the sea is relatively invisible, relatively far from view, relatively uncontrollable by states. And we have like lighthouses that still make the shore visible from the sea, and so there's all these kind of basic rudimentary technologies to try to give some control over the sea, but basically it's beyond visibility. And now that's no longer the case. We have visibility fully in terms of satellite technology, in terms of drones, in terms of other technologies. And so there's a kind of territorialization of the sea. And the hypothesis would be that this territorialization that comes with visibility at the very least, creates a rupture in that history of, solidarity at sea.
Looking at the clock, I am afraid we really have to wrap things up now. Itamar Mann, thank you very, very much for your time and for sharing your thoughts with us. And we're looking forward to your new book. And also thank you, dear audience, for listening, for your time, for your attention, and for your participation. I would once again like to thank Anna Pollmann, who you saw and maybe also a little bit heard in the beginning of this talk, for conceptualizing the series. And furthermore, thank Julia Jürgens, Katja Wadke, and Peter Rohrmann, who made this evening possible, who planned, who organized, who invited, and who took care of all the technical issues around this event. And we're very happy to welcome you again for our next lecture. We'll have 3 more lectures until the end of September in this lecture series. And I'm very much looking forward to talking to Ayelet Shachar, to Maximilian Pichel, and to Miriam Rürup about shifting borders, about migration control, and about statelessness. You'll find all the info about the upcoming events and also the dates on the website of the Jewish Museum Berlin. And to stay tuned, please subscribe also to the museum's newsletter, in which you will also find everything you need to know about the museum's anniversary program that's happening these days. Thank you very much and have a nice evening. And thank you, Itamar, for your time.
Thank you.